Well, good morning, everybody. This really is the Sunrise Club. I really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be here, Bruce. Just a little quick bio about me. My name is Anders Ibsen. I am a lifer. I was born in Tacoma General, grew up in the West End for most of my life, and my wife and I live in the beautiful Proctor District. It is really my privilege to represent North End and West End Tacoma. I see a lot of familiar faces here. And yes, as Bruce alluded, we are talking about making Tacoma healthier and happier. That's really ultimately what we're talking about in the context of Rotary, because you guys really are a community organization, and that's fundamentally based on the belief that there's more that unites us than divides us. And that's really what we're here to talk to you about, is kind of the human condition. We all love, we all eat, we all work, we all get sick. And that's really one of the unifying conditions. The unfortunate part of that is that not everyone responds to it in the same way. There are a lot of people who have are really blessed with the opportunity to have security in their job and to have security in their person when tragedy happens or when they get sick, when a loved one gets sick. But in places like Tacoma, for example, about 2 out of every 5 people, or about 40% of people, when they get sick, have either coercion, either are forced to go to work because they're explicitly told, go to work or you'll be fired, or they face economic pressure because they might not have some kind of benefit. So they get sick and they think to themselves, well, I still have to pay the rent, I still have to make ends meet, I'm still going to go to work, even though I'm sick and I'm hacking my lungs out. And we have the benefit of having a nice breakfast in front of us, but imagine if you were eating at some kind of chain restaurant. You don't know whether or not the person handling your food was sick or not, right? That's kind of unsettling, but that's really the norm, especially in places like the restaurant industry or the retail industry and so forth. And it's really a tragedy. And it's something that a number of cities across the country have started to address, and something that I'd like Tacoma to address as well, namely with regards to a policy called paid sick leave. What paid sick leave is, it's a pretty much slim to no overhead policy for local businesses that basically allows qualified, hardworking employees at businesses with a certain number of employees to start accruing paid time off after they've worked there for a longer term period of time and after an amount of hours. To give you some reference, cities like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, San Francisco, California, Washington, D.C., and Seattle, just about a year ago, they've implemented these ordinances. They've had practically no overhead impact to the businesses implementing them, because they actually save money long term, because there's lower overhead and because people use it very infrequently, about 1 to 2 days per year on average. And to give you some specifics, Sandy's the policy expert, I'm just the politician. In Seattle's ordinance, it doesn't even start until you started working about 6 months or so. And after that, you accrue like 1 hour paid time off after every 40 hours worked. So at most, that's a week per year, which, like I said, our studies have shown that people use about 1 to 2 days per year max. So it's very low overhead. It saves you a ton in terms of employee satisfaction, in terms of not having to spend a lot of money and time and resources and energy retraining people and marketing for new positions because you're charging for employees. And it's just the right thing to do in our opinion, because no one should have to worry about getting fired if they get sick. No one should be forced to infect their coworkers or infect the public or infect their boss if they get sick. And you shouldn't have to be afraid about what's in your food when you're going out to eat with your family. So that's really kind of the gist of what we're trying to accomplish. We are really blessed to have wide support from a number of small business, neighborhood, and labor organizations. Some of our endorsements include Temple Bethel. Thank you, Rabbi Kaden, for your endorsement. Faith organizations like the Tacoma Ministerial Alliance, neighborhood organizations, business groups like the various leaders of entities like the Stadium, Dome, and Proctor business districts, for example. And we were really interested in putting together a good policy committee of people from the small business, faith, and neighborhood entities to hear your perspective and how we can make this a good policy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sandy. We're really interested in hearing your thoughts and answering your questions, and hopefully getting your support as well. So I'll turn it over to my friend, and then we'll take your questions.
Yeah, just before we take questions too, I wanted to give you guys a few more numbers so you know the reality of what it's like here in Tacoma. For example, grocery workers, 1 in 4 grocery workers don't have any form of paid sick days. So those are folks that are handling the food that you're going to take home to your families. And about 80% of food service and accommodation, so hotel workers, restaurant workers, 80% of those people don't have any type of paid sick time. So we're looking at a lot of the low-wage jobs, people that work at Walmart, work at Target, work at McDonald's. They have no options, and those are the people that are we're in contact with and are handling our food too. So it's a very important issue, especially around this time when we have a lot of illnesses, we have the flu epidemic, and also a policy like this could also help people that are in domestic violence situations. It could offer paid safe time, so if someone is in a domestic violence situation and they need a court order, they can also take the time out of their day to get that and protect themselves and their family. So with that said, does anyone have any questions?
Really?
Yes.
So,
should I take the mic over here if you want to
no, I
project?
can project very
Okay.
well. So there's obviously a lot of changes going on in Washington, across the country now with the Affordable Care Act, and employers that don't have insurance now are either going to have to pay into a pool, or the individuals are taxed at a pretty heavy burden. Who subsidizes this at the employer level? These local employees who don't currently have a health coverage, health insurance, are going to be forced to go to an exchange, or under the Affordable Care Act will have to pay for these. Is there a subsidy if these cities are doing this? Is this?
Sure. Well, this is actually completely different from the Affordable Care Act. It has nothing to do with health insurance. So I personally have my own opinion on the healthcare thing. It's a little bit more nuanced. I, for one, think they could have done a much better job with it personally. But this is actually completely separate from medical care. This is about basically paid time off relating to when you get sick. In terms of costs, Sandy has more of the particulars to it, but basically we found in our studies of some of the cities that have implemented this for a number of years, I think the longest ones were either Milwaukee or San Francisco. They've had it for like 5 to 7 years. They found that I think 85% of the businesses who were impacted, namely the ones who had some kind of paid sick leave policy that they put in place, 85% of them had absolutely no overhead costs whatsoever, just because workers tended to use it so infrequently, more like a form of insurance. And even that 15% had a very minuscule cost. Simply put, because there's a lot of hidden costs in the status quo that we don't tend to think about, but are still really burdensome. Like it costs 3 times as much for your employee costs if you have turnover, if you have to retrain someone, if you have to get them back up to speed to cover someone who just got burned out and had to leave, for example. So there are a lot of factors like that to keep in mind as well. Sandy, do you have something to add?
Yeah, so like we were saying, in San Francisco they did a survey of about 1,000 business owners, and they found out that employees were taking 1 to 2 days a year. So what that, if we're talking about an employee that works, at a restaurant that's probably working minimum wage and getting tips or something, you're spending about 20 cents a day on the employee to take the time off. Basically is what it amounts to. And that's on the higher end if they're taking 2 days. If they're taking 1 day a year, you're spending 10 cents a day to cover that cost.
Just one more thing to add. This is something that we're talking about for the most vulnerable. We're talking about that 40% that doesn't have it. But keep in mind that means that 60% already do offer this. That means we're looking at companies like Russell, like DeVito, like Multicare. That means that most of these really successful businesses in the area already offer this benefit. Many businesses in the area that are thriving already do. So in a lot of respects, we're not looking at doing something new so much as making the market consistent, and so much as rewarding employers who are already generous and who are already foresightful enough to offer this benefit, just introducing a bit more consistency. Chris, you want to ask something more?
I'll agree with that to some extent because, for example, my employer, PTO, pay time off, is pay time off.
Exactly.
If I take vacation, it's pay time off. If I call in sick, it goes against my pay time off.
Precisely.
Whether it's good or not. So some of these smaller businesses, these part-time employees, if they choose to take time off for vacation, now it's like, well, I'd rather come in sick because I don't want to take the PTO and use that so I can go to Disneyland or whatever. And I'll come in sick and infect everybody else. So you're talking about pay time off for sickness versus pay time off that someone's going to use for an accrual for vacation time.
Exactly, and this is actually even more targeted. That's a great point you make, Chris, because this is something that in at least a really, really rough draft we're putting together only affects you if you're sick, if a family member or loved one is sick, or if your child is sick and you have to pick them up, for example, or if there's a domestic violence situation and you need to take steps to make yourself safe. So being narrowly targeted and making sure that this is something that's only used in legitimate situations is really important. And all the more reason why we're really happy to have really good input from our business friends. Yes, sir.
So you're drafting this currently as a potential ordinance, city ordinance, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
What would be the threshold as far as who it would apply to? And,
Well,
and worker hours, you know, what's the threshold in terms of who would be eligible?
That's definitely why we're here today too, because we're currently forming a policy committee to hash out all those details. So we've been looking at the Seattle ordinance and San Francisco, and they've had, you know, different guidelines. For example, they say for every 40 hours worked, you get 1 hour of paid time off. So in a whole year, that at most would be maybe 6 days out of the year. But like we said, you can have a cap as well. It can't be more than 72 hours in a year, or an employer has to have at least 4 full-time employees. That's Seattle's policy. So if you're a sole proprietor, this isn't going to affect you.
There are a lot of details, and they're all very negotiable.
Yeah, and my information is on those handouts, so you can email me or call me, and if you want to be a part of the policy committee, we're actually having our next meeting March 6th at 9:30 a.m. at the IBEW local.
So in these other cities, or what you're proposing, is there a, like the Affordable Health Care Act, is there a size business that's on the radar, or does it apply to every business, whether you have 2 people or 200?
It would definitely determine kind of how we see it, and you know, we're still working out those details, but we're looking at it affects small, medium to large businesses. So it could be if you have 4, you know, full-time employees up to, you know, 1,000, the huge employers as well.
Do you see limiting this to full-time employees? There's
So-
a lot of so many of these people have 2 jobs, 3 jobs, and they're piecemealing.
Yeah, so that would depend. We could qualify and define an employer as someone that has at least 4 full-time employees, but within that company, if there's part-time employees, they could be covered. Temporary workers, that's iffy. You know, sometimes some restaurants hire seasonal workers that are only there 3 months out of the year, and is it really cost-effective to offer something like that for them, or do we want to have them be on for 6 months? Those are all details we've yet to work out, but we really want input from business owners as to what's going to make their businesses more prosperous and what's going to be better for them as opposed to just what we think.
Are you working with the Restaurant Association to get their perspective? Because they study intensely on national level and local level.
Sure. We actually do have a couple of, actually a number of restaurant owners who are already a part of the coalition. They include, they're members of our committee. They include Joe Storchini from Giuseppe's, excellent Italian. They include Uncle Therm's, which is a really great kind of soul food Lincoln restaurant, and Quickie Tooth from the Hilltop Business District too.
I'm not talking about the Restaurant Association, which represents 1 million restaurants and is a better cross-section of what goes on.
Oh yeah, there's definitely a lot of room for outreach in the future. That's a great point. Is there a question in the back? Yes, sir.
Are you looking at any measures to help persuade employees from abusing the system?
Yes.
So there will be different type of employer protections. For example, an employer could request a doctor's note. So we were talking to, for example, Gordon Nacarado from Pack Grill, and he was saying, well, you know what, I don't want my employees using this to call in if they're hungover. And I don't want them, you know, to take advantage of this as a personal day off. So an employer could request a doctor's note and have that so that, you know, it's kind of a safeguard for that. But, you know, as we said in San Francisco, where the ordinance has been in effect 4 or 5 years now, they typically see an employee use it once, twice a year. So there hasn't been that much abuse in cities that have implemented it already.
Yeah, go for it.
I worked for 33 years as a pilot for United Airlines, and as such, we accrued sick leave at the rate of 5 hours per month to a cap of 1,000 hours per year. It didn't take long for most career pilots to achieve that 1,000 hours, and once that number is achieved, the incidence of sick leave abuse among certain individuals is very obvious. And another aspect of it was that as pilots got toward the end of their career, since no one paid, if you used this sick leave, you used it. If you didn't, you lost it. So toward the end of people's careers, people would tend to get sick lots more often. So as a practical matter, that's how it works. And sick leave abuse is a real problem for many companies, small and big.
If I can address it real quick.
That's definitely something that we're interested in hearing about. As Sandy alluded to, we have looked at this in terms of not pilots or any one particular industry, but just the entire kind of cross-section macroeconomically. And while we have found, in general, really small usage of the program, most people just tend to want to work and use it. We're definitely hearing if there's any kind of extra accountability measures that we can introduce to minimize those risks even more. So Sandy mentioned doctor's notes. There's even the notion of use it or lose it. Should you really accrue these really vast pools of benefit time that you can just use to go to Disneyland or whatever? Or can you only be limited to a certain period of time in the year after which it starts all over again? There's also some ideas about you can only take off in one spurt. You can only take off 2 days maximum, for example. So there's, like I said, a lot of different ways that you can use the flexibility of the system and kind of craft it into the ideal policy. So if you have any particular ideas about that, there's information on that sheet, and we'd love to hear about it. In the back.
Do you see a problem if we were looking at doctor's notes, that people are going to be willing to go to the doctor, even if they have insurance or don't have insurance, there's going to be an expense to that. Are they still going to come to work sick rather than take the expense and the time and the effort to go to the doctor?
Great question. We actually have a provision in there. Sandy, can you explain a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So in some cities, a provision could be that you will have to be liable for the cost, you as the employee. Other cities have split the cost, where if you're requiring that you and your employer split the cost of that fee. It all depends. Like I said, we don't have anything written out in stone, so that's something that we're looking at to try to figure out. But it could work out either way.
So I guess I'm a little confused. The second photo here is of Sharon, who is a nurse.
Yes.
And I would assume that Sharon as a nurse is covered by whatever hospital or whatever, and she has a paid time off or some sort of sick leave policy. And that if she is really hurt, she would use up her sick leave, she would get short-term disability or long-term disability through her employer, and thus would not be affected by this at all. Would she?
I think it depends. I think Sharon in that situation was the terms of was working with also a union, and the terms of the collective bargaining agreement didn't allow for her to take the time off. And so that's another provision as well. If you're part of a union, this ordinance would be waived, and you'd be subject to the express terms of your collective bargaining agreement. So that's also an issue for some folks that are under a collective bargaining agreement.
And one more thing to add is that in most of the cities that have this, there's usually a provision that says that if your employer already has some kind of a system in place like you were talking about, they already have some kind of disability payment system or a PTO system like Chris was talking about, then this doesn't apply, and the current situation is already there. And the intent behind that is just kind of basically reducing complexity. If you have something more or less that already offers the same benefit, then that can usually work. There's another hand up. Yes, sir.
What's your overall time frame? I mean, is this a 6-month effort, and an ordinance might be drafted by...
When it's ready, basically. That's my attitude as a lawmaker. I prefer to do things right the first time rather than have an arbitrary timeline and then mess it up and then have to go back a second time and so forth. So we are doing our due diligence right now to seek lots and lots of consensus from all stakeholders in the community like yourselves. And once we have something that looks good, then I'll start drafting it. Yes, sir.
I'm hearing a lot of provisions and details and this and that. Who in a small business would be capable or be able to handle all this and not completely take their eye off?
And just not lose their mind with regulations, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very serious deal. I mean, our industry's in turmoil over the Affordable Health Care Act right now. every time something like this happens, an agency, it turns you upside down.
Oh,
I
yeah,
do
that's-
all
that's-
this for a company that's 86 employees.
At first glance, yeah, it can always seem scary. It's always like, oh, one extra new thing to do. I'm already working so hard on all these other things, and you want to do something new. And that's usually how we start off with, with a lot of business outreach. In fact, there's a really remarkable lady by the name of Bikini Howell. She's an owner of 3 restaurants up in Seattle. One is called the Plum Bistro, and her parents own Quickie 2 over in Hilltop, which is one of our supporting restaurant owners. And the paperwork is actually quite minimal. There's oftentimes these rules basically have a minimal record-keeping requirement. More or less, if you can just have a rough system in place that more or less keeps track of it, then that will suffice. You don't really have to cross your T's and dot your I's so much. But I think Sandy has some additional insight into this too.
Typically the record keeping too could be in place where you do your regular record keeping with the hours collected and all of that. And also where small businesses, those that are smaller than 250 employees, for example, they would have about a year or so to also work out the details before the provision would be enacted. So let's say in Seattle it passed September 2011. They were enacting it September 2012. Small businesses have still another year to work out the details and see how they're going to implement that. So they were given about a 2-year grace period to figure out the details before it went into effect for them. So that was something that small business owners in Seattle decided, you know what, we're going to need this time to figure it out and not be pressured by a detail as just when it starts.
I think you just made my point. You're giving them 2 years to figure this thing out because it would be so onerous.
What was a grace period? I'm not sure exactly how onerous it was in Seattle. I wasn't involved in that process, but I think it was just giving them a little bit more time.
Is there any discussion of making this a 5-year test plan, so it ends if it doesn't work, instead of going on forever?
Well, my preference, like I said before, is to do things right the first time so that there's no ambiguity or doubt. I mean, I can certainly respect the intent behind that, which is really more along the lines of sort of what we were just talking about, making sure that this is really something we're comfortable and secure with, instead of something that may or may not work and we'll just have to see. My intent is to do all that figuring out in the beginning rather than the end. And that's really the reason why we're here, is to hear from you, to hear your questions, which we really appreciate, and as well as to have any kind of follow-up that you might like towards the end. Relating to onerousness, I mean, I myself have worked in a number of small businesses. I'm currently working in an appraisal firm. And in terms of what you're really keeping track of here, I mean, math is really kind of a part of our day-to-day lives. I mean, I have Excel spreadsheets and QuickBooks and so forth. And really, at the end of the day, what we're asking people to do through this kind of system is really just, in my opinion, basic addition. I mean, we already keep track of hours, we already keep track of benefits, we already keep track of salary. This is just an additional, it's basically algebra. If 1 hour, then this amount and so forth. And at the end of the day, it's really kind of a simple system. We've had a number of restaurant owners, for example, who originally had some kind of apprehension, like another regulation, what are you asking me to do? But as time went on, as they sort of had more buy-in to the process and provided their input, then this was something that a lot of people have kind of become more acclimated to. And that being said, we're still happy to hear what you have to say, and if you'd like to serve on our committee and make this the best policy possible, then we'd really appreciate that. In the back?
Through your research thus far, have you found there's a certain demographic to the employer groups that aren't covered with benefits? Because I know, as a business owner, the idea behind paid time off is to attract good workers to stay with you. And I would imagine, you've done more research on this than me, I would imagine most of the companies that currently aren't offering this are low margin companies, positions where tips are a major part of the compensation. And there's a reason that not always, but there's often a reason there aren't benefit packages, because they're either tips are the primary thing, or because there's such a low margin profession where there's a lot of turnover and there's a lot of young people coming through that come on for a year or two and disappear. Have you found the demographic to be true of that or not?
That's actually a really good point. That is accurate. Most of these positions tend to be low wage. They tend to be in the service sector, restaurant, big box retail, and so forth. It's kind of a chicken and the egg question, in my opinion, because you can ask, are they low wage because there's such high turnover, or is it really high turnover because they're really low wage and people, as this gentleman was talking about, are working multiple jobs and frequently getting sick and either getting fired because they decide not to come to work because they're just too sick to get out of bed, or there's just some other variable there. In my opinion, and based on our research, it really does save you a lot more money long term to think holistically. Because, for example, we were talking about costing 3 times as much to process a new employee, to get them up to speed, to train them, to market the position, and so forth, versus keeping an employee on board who's happier, who already has the skill set, who has high morale, who works harder, who isn't going to infect the other coworkers and put them through the same situation, and who isn't going to infect your clientele. And I mean, ultimately, a happy workplace isn't just something that's good for its own sake, although it is, but it's ultimately something that helps your bottom line and gives you a better image with your clientele, which ultimately helps boost your demand and give you more business long term. So it's really less a question of how much more are you paying, and it's more a question of longer term, what's a better investment? And we found that to be the case both financially as well as just morally. I mean, I for one think it's not moral to have a situation where someone who wants to work hard, is put in a position where they're forced to choose between their health and their paycheck. And that's what we're seeking to rectify. If anything to add, Sandy?
No, well, I just want to just say that this, echo what Andrew said, and that we don't want people to go to work feeling sick. And there are a lot of people that, I've come in contact with, workers at the Best Western and at McDonald's that I literally feared whether they're going to be able to afford groceries the next day because, they're sick or their child is sick and they can't pick up their child who is sick from school. And so it's really an issue that's affecting a lot of people. And at the end of the day, we don't want those people to feel as if they can't survive and they can't be able to thrive as much as other people are in society with them. So I think that's it for me.
Yeah. Anyone else?